Ngāwiri Waititi indicating Māori would start their own separate parliament from the steps outside the beehive, saying all Māori would be listened to with the focus on mokopuna livelihood and decision.
This place has led us down in a way that we have never seen in my life. The same way it led our tūpuna down.
It is time for us to step comfortably and courageously into Rangatiratanga.
Very emotional, really. It is.
It's a proud moment for us, for Te Iwi Māori.
There is very little detail about what they want to do, so at this stage this should be viewed as a stunt, and it didn't have the desired effect of overshadowing the budget.
A separate parliament?
Yes.
So what does that actually mean?
It's not new, Jack, if you go back to the 1890s.
Kia ora, I'm Tom Kitchen, and today on The Detail, dreams of a Māori parliament. Why are there calls for it? And what could it actually look like? Tūwhinaroa Ngā Tanahira of Te Apauri and Ngā Te Hine is a Māori news journalist at RNZ.
So there was the hikoi on Budget Day. They called it a nationwide activation day or nationwide Māori Day of Action.
We are in activation mode.
It was the second one that we've had so far.
Protesters have gathered up and down the country this morning to stand against the new government's Māori policy. The Te Pāti Māori organised protest has been coordinated on Auckland motorway networks like here in Albany.
Both, of course, have been in opposition to the government's sort of policies and rhetoric towards Māori. Te Pāti Māori used that as an opportunity when they were down in Parliament to announce, look, we want to set up an independent Māori Parliament, an entity of governance completely separate from the Crown. It's not necessarily new. I mean, it's been part of their manifesto now since they first got into Parliament, but the time feels right to sort of reinvigorate that and say, look, there is a want there and a hunger for Māori to govern themselves in a way or be more separate from the Crown. So that's essentially why it's in the headlines now.
But this debate was also in the headlines 200 years ago. Margaret Mutu of Ngāti Kahu, Te Rarawa and Ngāti Whātua is a professor of Māori studies at the University of Auckland. She also chaired Mātiki Mai Aotearoa, an iwi-led working group on constitutional transformation. She says to understand where this call for a Māori Parliament comes from, we have to know about He Hakapūtanga, the Declaration of Independence in 1835, and Te Tiriti o Waitangi of 1840.
In order to understand what they are, you need to understand the context in which they were drawn up.
Sure.
So the He Hakapūtanga, what you had happening sort of in the early 1800s was that you had Pākehā coming in. By and large, most of them were fine. They abided by the tikanga, that's the law of this country. But you had a handful that were troublesome. And they congregated around Kororareka, which is these days known as Russell. And after a while, they really did bother the rangatira of the day. Now, they used to come together to talk about all sorts of things. And this was one of the matters they talked about. They sought advice from the missionaries in particular. They could see that the missionaries couldn't control these people. So they asked the missionaries if there was anyone who could control these people, and they said, yes, there was the King of England. So some of them travelled to England just to have a look and saw for themselves that, yes, indeed, the king did know how to control these people. So they met with the King of England while they were over there and reached an agreement with him that, yes, it was worth establishing a diplomatic alliance between the two countries, but they asked for an ambassador to be sent over for them because they explain, to the country that they're in how their people see the world and how their people behave. So they sent over the British resident. On the British resident's advice was that you need to draw up a statement that tells these people what the law is in this country, who makes the laws, who's in charge, essentially what is the constitutional makeup of the country. That's what lawyers would call it. So the British resident drafted up what he labelled the Declaration of Independence. And in that, he made it really clear that all sovereignty or power and all authority lay with the chiefs of the hapu, with the rangatira of the hapu, and that they would never, ever give that power and authority that they hold to anyone else. He called it sovereignty in the English one. They would send this statement to the King of England just so that any other Pākehā who were coming out here would know what the constitutional makeup of this country was. So there you have that. That gets translated into Māori and gets signed in 1835 as He Hakaputanga. So that's a declaration of what the constitutional makeup of this country is.
Yeah, so this is where we are. We've had this signed in 1835, and then what next? Okay,
so this is promulgated to the Pākehās as well to make sure that they know. But the ones around Kororareka, around Russell, still kept misbehaving, and quite badly misbehaving, to the point that Kororareka became known as the hellhole of the Pacific in the rest of the world. In the end, what the rangatira said was, look, we're quite fed up with these people, and we really do not want to be responsible for them. And so they asked, by now it was Queen Victoria, whether the Queen would please take control of her lawless people. And you will see that in the preamble of Te Tiriti. So the Queen of England agreed, or her agents that she sent down here, which was Hobson, sent him down. Yes, they would take control of the Pākehās. The mechanism that they could use to control the Pākehās was the mechanism that the rangatira had seen when they were in England. And that's essentially Pākehā culture, English legal system, that they could use that to control the Pākehās in this country. The rest of Te Tiriti simply confirmed He Hakaputanga, said that the rangatira would remain in charge, and that's the tino rangatiratanga that they would maintain. All of our lands, forests, and everything else would remain ours undisturbed.
Obviously, that has not stuck.
No, so Hobson, of course, was very disingenuous, because within 3 months of signing that treaty, he then issued a proclamation in May 1840 saying that the British had taken over the country, effectively declaring British sovereignty.
And that was not part of Te Tiriti?
Oh, absolutely no way. And it was a proclamation issued in English with no consultation with the rangatira at all. Why I mention that is because the legal system, the justice system, the whole system you have at the moment is based on that proclamation. So Māori have time and again over the past 100-odd years or 180 years tried to go to the Pākehā courts over our land, over all sorts of things, and always been blocked by the existence of that proclamation. And that proclamation effectively said everything belongs to the Queen of England. It wasn't till you got to the Waitangi Tribunal in the 1970s that you were allowed to look behind that proclamation, but not legally. You could only do it, the tribunal can only do it by way of recommendations.
That's right, yeah. So let's talk about, we've got to the point of, after this proclamation, we've talked about the treaty, talked about the Declaration of Independence. So how did Māori representation actually develop from there on the National Parliament stage?
Pākehā went ahead and set themselves up a parliament deliberately excluding Māori. And Māori kept saying to them, you can't do this, but of course they weren't listening.
Well, there's a few things about Māori representation I'd like to talk about. So Māori seats they came forward in 1867, right? That's when they were introduced. So what were they all about?
If you're going to be making decisions about what you're doing, you can't do so without the people who are actually in charge of the country. And so harassing all the time to be included in the Pākehā Parliament, finally being allowed to do so in 1867, but only with 4 seats, when in terms of the population of the time, we should have had 20. So it was always only ever included on Pākehā terms. So you've got your Pākehā Parliament set up. It's been set up as a mirror image of Westminster. It has no Māori consideration in there whatsoever. When our members came in there in 1867, that was exactly what it was. We sent rangatira in there, but they were immediately demonised, they were marginalised and never really had a say.
So after that, there were ideas for Māori to develop their own kind of parliament, right? What were they?
So all the way through, you've always had Māori representatives coming together to discuss things. So they were doing it in the early 1800s. They were doing it right the way through. Now they formalised that in 1892, what became known as the Pāremata Māori, the Māori Parliament.
Te kotahitanga?
That's right. It was the bringing of people together. That kotahitanga had 96 representatives from around the country. It met regularly, it met in different places, and it drew up legislation. It allowed the 4 members of the Pākehā Parliament to come into that kotahitanga. The role of those 4 members of Parliament, of the Pākehā Parliament, was to sit and see the legislation that was made and then take that legislation back to the Pākehā Parliament so that it could be included in there. When they took it back to the Pākehā Parliament, all the Pākehās got up and walked out, so there wasn't a quorum. Then the Pākehā Parliament instructed 1 or 2 of those 4 Māori representatives. They sent them back into the Māori Parliament to close it down in 1902. And this is what happens all the time, of course. Whenever Māori set up a national body, the Pākehā Parliament will always send in various ones to either take control of it or to destroy it.
So was there any legislation that was ever passed by Te Kotahitanga? No, nothing.
Oh, by kotahitanga?
Yes.
Oh, yes. In kotahitanga, they passed a lot of legislation. It was to ensure that land stayed with the hapu, that there was no theft of land, that we had access to proper health services, all that sort of thing got dealt with.
My understanding that there were Māori councils that devolved out of this parliament, is that right?
That's out of the Pākehā Parliament, and the Māori Council and the Māori district councils and those sorts of things have only ever been Pākehā constructs.
And then in 75, as we talked about, we had the Waitangi Tribunal, and we did a podcast on that earlier if listeners want to listen to that. As we talked about, there was nothing went through law, it was all recommendation, right?
The Waitangi Tribunal's brief is to inquire into breaches of the principles of the treaty, and to make recommendations. The tribunal does have powers to order the return of land, but the government has worked for the past 30-odd years to stop the tribunal doing it.
So where do we sit now in terms of Māori representation around the motu?
Māori throughout the country, we still come together in various groups. The one that I know the best is National Iwi Chairs Forum that was set up in 2005. But you do have other groups as well who come together. And we have always been coming together trying to deal with the oppression that continues to come out of the Pākehā Parliament. And that is what you're starting to see now. There was a formal establishment of a group to look at constitutional transformation.
And that's Mātiki Mai Aotearoa, yes?
That's right.
So you came up with a report. How did you develop this report?
We were set up in 2010. We spent 5 years going around the country asking Māori groups, whether they were whānau, hapu, iwi, sports groups, youth groups, anything. We had 350 hui around the country asking people, if you could make your own decisions for your own lives tomorrow, what would it look like? We were told to bring back models for a constitution based on he hakaputanga, te tiriti and tikanga. When we asked them what it would look like, they kept going back to the values and saying, if you get the values right, then the rest of it will fall out of it naturally.
Those values were things like place, tikanga, community, belonging and balance.
We ended up with 6 models, told to draw up one and we couldn't draw up one.
Yeah.
I expected it to be a bicameral one where you had a sphere where Māori made decisions for our lives and for everything relating to us and all our resources. And then the Kāwanatanga sphere is where the Crown would make decisions for its people. And the two of them would just have to learn to talk to each other. But the one that seems to be being talked about is the one where you have the Rangatiratanga sphere, the Māori sphere, Kāwanatanga sphere, the Crown sphere, and a third one, the relational sphere where representatives from those two bodies come together and are on an equal footing and make decisions on matters that impact on both.
In practice, are we talking a big parliament building with a couple of, houses and chambers where people debate? Like, what are we talking about realistically in practice?
I was hoping you'd ask me that question because the Māori Parliament, and this is perhaps why I prefer not to call it a parliament, or
Sure.
the Māori House, would be very, very different from the Pākehā Parliament. The Pākehā Parliament is a building in Wellington, it's fixed and it doesn't ever move. Māori don't operate like that. We take our huis, our national huis, to different places of the country in order to recognise the mana of the different iwi around the country. It has no fixed location. What would it look like? There would be representation. And that's something that we're currently discussing now. What will that representation look like? That's why we keep holding these big national huis, is to talk about these sorts of things.
The most recent hui was held at Omahu Marae near Heretaunga, Hastings, the day after Budget Day. Tūwhenua Ngā Tanahira was there.
So the one in Hastings was the next step in the accumulation of all of that discussion, I guess, and all those ideas.
Can we talk about what was discussed in Hastings? So there were several iwi leaders who had specific ideas for a Māori parliament.
Yep.
Could you take me through some of those ideas?
Every iwi came with their own ideas. The idea of a Māori parliament was put up by Baden Barber from Ngāti Kahungunu, and he wanted to base it on a Māori parliament that was set up in his rohe back in 1892. The structure of that one is pretty loose right now. As I say, all of these ideas are still being discussed. We'd have an upper house, which would consist of effectively elected Māori leaders, a wahine, so a woman, a tāne, a man. I think there's about 6 or 12. That's the sort of the rough structure, who are elected by Māori at large. There'd be a lower house, which would represent the rest of te iwi Māori. And then above that, they call it te tahu, or the ridgepole, which would be a house that sort of sits above them, which would have Māori spiritual leaders or traditional leaders like Kingi Tuheitia or the hahis, te hahi rātana, and sort of sirs and dames as well, I guess. So that was one model that was proposed. Another one that came up was the establishment of a federation of Māori tribes. So that one was proposed by Helmut Modlik. He is the chief executive of Ngāti Tuarangatira down in Wellington. Different kind of structure with that one, on the idea which many tribes hold that they are independent nations. And so you would come together in a sort of congress and discuss contemporary issues and divvy out funding, I suppose, and all that sort of thing. And so those are just a couple of the big ideas that were discussed.
The Minister of Māori Development, Tama Pōtaka, was here too, wasn't he?
Yes, he was.
Did he stand up to speak? Or
He did stand up to speak, got booed a little bit. I think pretty brave of him to go there, considering the mood.
What did he say?
Speaking to media outside of the conference, he was asked the question.
Is it hard being the face of some of those decisions that are really unpopular?
No, it's not hard because I think we're doing it for the right reason.
Why is this happening now? Is it because of dissatisfaction around the current government, or is it more, just a natural progression of, the development of this idea?
I think that idea, I think it would be unfair to say that ideas of Māori unification haven't been around, are new and fresh. They are not. A collective voice and a collective power has always been front of mind for many Māori leaders and Māori thought leaders as well. It's an idea that's been around for a very, very long time. And I guess the reaction to this current government has sort of sparked a deeper hunger for those discussions to be had and for the formation of something.
How realistic do you think this is?
I think economically it's very, very, very possible. I mean, if you have a look at some of the iwi that were there, Ngaitahu, it's worth 1.9 billion. Waikato Tainui, I think, worth about 1.2 billion. So in terms of economic influence, just off two Māori tribes, I think the formation of an organisation with some economic power is certainly possible. But as was discussed at the hui that have been going on all year, the biggest hurdle to Māori coming together is kotahitanga, that idea of unity. Māori have never been unified before. You have to treat tribes as independent nations with their own ideas of how they'd like to govern or interests. And so coming together and coming up with any kind of alliance or unified group will be exceptionally difficult, and that'll be the main hurdle, is how can we come together, unify, and then stay strong and keep those bonds strong. That'll be the main thing that holds them back. Whether or not it'll end up in a parliament or a federation, nobody really knows yet.
With the last Labour government, you had one or two quite brave Māori ministers in there who really did try to make a difference for us and try and lift at least some of the oppression off us. And I have to name Nanaia Mahuta. Willie Jackson was very good as well, and Calvin helped us as well.
Calvin Davis.
And so they managed to get things through. You've now got a government who is very openly hostile to Māori, and it's been quite cruel and quite brutal in the way that it's done it. Now, what that has done is it's actually galvanised our people and brought us all together, and it's really to protect ourselves from an onslaught that has really been very, very bruising. And so we've done that. We've come together. I understand that the Pākehā Parliament, there's a lot of attacks coming in on the Māori Party. What I would ask people to recognise is that the Māori Party is in there, in all of these huis, with us, listening very carefully, and then taking out what they are being told and telling the public. Now, this is something that has not been done well in this country over the past 200 years. Māori have always talked this type of talk about controlling our own lives, about not being dictated to, about getting rid of racism in this country. We have talked about that all my life, all my parents' life, on our marae, but we've never articulated it clearly to the Pākehā world. They have misunderstood where we're coming from. What the Māori Party is doing is articulating very clearly where not only we are coming from, but where we've actually been coming from the last 200 years.
You say in the report that 2040 would be a good year to set as a goal for some kind of constitutional transformation. Is that when you want to see this kind of parliament or whatever you like to call it in place?
So it's when the constitutional transformation will be complete and in place. Now, what we will see, the country we will see then is a country where being Māori, being Pākehā in this country is normalised. And I would see a place, for example, where everybody in this country speaks both English and Māori and nobody thinks that that's odd. And where he hakaputanga and te tiriti is just the way we are, and we all wonder what the hell was everybody complaining about before.
Yeah, so that will be 200 years from the signing of Te Tiriti.
That's right.
So this will definitely happen.
Oh, yes. I have no doubt whatsoever that it will happen.
That's it for today. The Detail is funded by RNZ and NZ On Air. Today's episode was produced by Alexia Russell, Davina Zimmer and Gwen McClure. It was engineered by Phil Benj. Ngā mihi nui te tūwhenua ngā Tanahira and Margaret Mutu. Ko Tam Kitchener Ho, ka kite anō.